Love, in the Middle Ages, was not simple. There were no dates at cafes, no midnight walks in the park, no secret texts or heart emojis. Romance lived in silence, in glances, in risk. It was whispered behind thick tapestries and hinted at across crowded great halls. It flourished in the smallest cracks of a world where nearly everything, land, family, legacy, religion, stood between two hearts. To understand medieval love, we must begin not with passion, but with power. Because love, as we think of it today, personal, emotional, free, was not the norm in the medieval mind. In fact, for most of the Middle Ages, love had very little to do with dating, and even less with marriage. Instead, marriages were often arranged, chosen by families, calculated like business deals. A daughter might be promised at birth. A son might be expected to marry a stranger to gain land, secure peace, or forge an alliance. Romance, when it happened, was more often a byproduct than a purpose. Still, people longed. They dreamed. They ached. They were human. Even in the most rigid of systems, love finds its way. But the first obstacle was always privacy, or rather, the lack of it. In castles, noble families lived side by side with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of servants, guards, and guests. Every movement was seen, every word overheard. High-ranking ladies were rarely alone, always accompanied by attendants or family members. Even lords were watched, constantly performing their role. In peasant cottages, things were even tighter. Whole families often slept in a single room. Children were born in view of the hearth. Privacy was a luxury only the wealthy could even hope for, and even they didn't have much of it. So how then did people fall in love? Carefully, quietly, dangerously. It might begin during a feast. The young knight, standing at the edge of the hall, catching the gaze of a lady seated with her father. A smile, almost imperceptible. Or perhaps during a festival, when the village gathered to celebrate a saint's day. Dances were held, ale was poured, hands brushed, eyes met. But any hint of affection had to be wrapped in layers of caution. Because love, especially when it crossed class boundaries or defied family plans, could be dangerous, even deadly. To be seen speaking too often with someone of the opposite sex might lead to whispers, and whispers led to gossip. And gossip, in a world ruled by reputation, could ruin lives. In noble courts especially, appearances were everything. A young lady might be banished to a convent for even the suspicion of impropriety. A knight might find himself stripped of favor, or worse, of land and title, if his flirtations offended a powerful family. Still, they found ways. They developed codes, the placement of a hand, the color of a ribbon, the way a goblet was lifted at a feast. These subtle cues spoke volumes to those who knew how to read them. Letters, though rare among the lower classes, were a lifeline for literate lovers, often passed through trusted servants or sympathetic clergy. They were written in flowery metaphorical language designed to conceal true meaning. The rose in your garden blooms brightly this spring, might be all a young nobleman dared to write, but the message was clear. But even these silent gestures carried risk. There were eyes everywhere, and love was patient. It had to be. In this world, it could take years for a romance to unfold. Many never did. Some ended before they ever truly began. And yet, people kept hoping. They dreamed of more than duty, of warmth, of shared glances, of gentle hands. Love was a rebellion, quiet and steady, blooming in the shadow of stone walls. In the medieval world, love rarely announced itself with bold declarations. It slipped through cracks, hid in silences, spoke not in words, but in symbols. Flirting, if it could even be called that, was often an act of courage and cleverness, because to say, "I like you," outright could ruin reputations, start feuds, or invite scandal. So instead, they found other ways. The language of objects. A gift was never just a gift. It was a message, carefully chosen, deeply coded. A single flower could say what 100 words could not. A red rose meant passion and admiration. A violet, humility and modesty. A daisy, innocence. A yellow flower might warn, "I love you, but I must be cautious." Even herbs carried meaning. Rosemary stood for remembrance. Thyme symbolized courage. Basil might suggest hatred or deep, unresolved feelings. These small tokens were often tucked into a lady's sleeve or a knight's glove before a tournament, sometimes left where they might be accidentally discovered, on a windowsill, a saddle, a church pew. These gestures were never random. In a world where even touching the wrong person could spark gossip, these little messages were precious, intimate, sacred. Glances and body language words were dangerous. So, the eyes did most of the talking. A prolonged glance across a feast table, a downward look at the exact moment of passing, a glance held too long by the church gate. All were part of a visual dialogue, one both subtle and powerful. There were unwritten rules. Look too long, and it was scandalous. Too short, and it meant indifference. Look back twice, that was a signal, an invitation. A silent yes. In the courts of Europe, especially in France and Italy, this silent communication became an art form. Courtly etiquette dictated when one could speak, where one could walk, even how one could stand. But no rule could stop a well-timed smile or a stolen glance across a candlelit room. The gesture of touch was rare, precious, dangerous. For nobles, a mere brush of the hand might be the highlight of an entire season. To help a lady down from her horse and feel the lightest pressure of her fingers, no gloves, was electric, scandalous, alive. Among peasants, there was more freedom, but also more eyes. A shared task, like carrying water from the well or tying bundles at harvest, might allow a quiet exchange, a shared smile, a shoulder brushed accidentally. These touches, light as air, were remembered for weeks. In the stillness of a sleepless night, one might lie in the straw and replay that tiny moment again and again, wondering what it meant. The power of silence. Medieval love, above all, valued restraint. Where modern romance often encourages expression and openness, medieval romance exalted mystery. To hold back was to show control. To speak in riddles was to show wisdom. To flirt without speaking was to prove you understood the sacred game. In noble courts, lovers would often communicate in poetry, usually written by others, quoted carefully to disguise their feelings. A line from a troubadour's song offered casually, "My heart is a prisoner, but no chains hold me." Or a line from a popular romance tale. The hawk returns to the gloved hand it trusts most. Each phrase carried hidden meaning. To those who listened, the message was clear. To others, it was just poetry. This allowed love to exist, right under the noses of watchful fathers, strict abbots, and scheming rivals. It was all about what you didn't say. The night, as ally nightfall, brought freedom. By day, actions were watched. But at night, behind shutters, under moonlight, new chances emerged. A knight might sing a song beneath a lady's window, not loudly, but just enough to be heard. A village boy might leave a token in the doorway of the girl he admired, gone before the rooster crowed. In some places, especially in rural customs, nighttime bundling rituals occurred, where couples lay in bed together, clothed, to speak and connect without physical intimacy. It was strange, beautiful, awkward, tender. And in a world where life was hard and death close, those rare moments of connection meant everything. For the nobles of medieval Europe, love was both a game and a weapon. Unlike the peasants, whose lives were often ruled by survival and simplicity, the upper classes had the luxury and the burden of formality. Their days were filled with ceremony, appearances, and subtle strategy, and nowhere was this more intricate than in the strange and shimmering world of courtly love. The concept began to take shape around the 12th century, particularly in the courts of southern France, where troubadours, noble-born poets and musicians began writing verses not about kings or battles, but about love, and not just any love, impossible love, forbidden love, distant love. It was always between a noble knight and a married lady of higher status. It could not be fulfilled. That was the point. In a society obsessed with structure, courtly love was meant to burn without consuming. It was a fire kept under glass. Knights were expected to devote themselves to a lady as they would to their liege lord, fighting in her name, writing her poetry, defending her honor. She, in turn, was to remain distant, gracious, unattainable. This wasn't seduction, it was worship. But of course, people are people. Sometimes, the fantasy became real, and that was where things got dangerous. The code of courtly love. The troubadours and poets created an elaborate system of rules for courtly love, though these were more ideal than reality. A few examples. Love cannot exist between husband and wife. Marriage was practical, love was spiritual. Jealousy proves true love. A noble lover must burn with longing, but never possess. Love must be kept secret. The moment it is spoken aloud, it begins to die. In this view, love was ennobling. It made knights more courteous, braver, gentler. It made ladies more gracious and wise. The lovers might never touch, might never speak openly, but they inspired each other to rise above base desire. That was the theory. Reality was more tangled, the risk of reality. Sometimes love went further than longing glances and poetry. Secret affairs, real ones, did happen in castles and courts, but they were dangerous, because noble families had eyes everywhere. Servants listened through keyholes. Cousins whispered to uncles. Political rivals used rumors as weapons. A lady found in an affair could be disgraced, exiled, even imprisoned in a convent. A knight might lose favor, or worse, his lands and reputation. Yet still they tried. Some hid love letters behind church altars. Others bribed trusted servants to carry messages and arrange brief, midnight meetings. A window left open, a candle lit in a certain way. The subtle choreography of passion in disguise. In some cases, even kings and queens were involved in these delicate dances. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, was herself a major patron of courtly love and may have inspired dozens of tales. Her court became legendary for its poetry, pageantry, and whispered secrets. Even today, historians debate how much of it was sincere and how much was play acting, because in many ways, courtly love was just that, a performance, a mirror held up to society, reflecting what it longed for but could not quite allow. Love and power. In the upper classes, romance was never just about affection. It was also about power. To be seen with the favor of a powerful lady might boost a young knight's career. To be admired by a handsome courtier might make a lady seem more desirable or more dangerous. And sometimes, Love was used to forge alliances. Flirtation became negotiation. A romantic gesture became a veiled threat or a political promise. Even the most beautiful poem could carry a hidden message. For instance, though I am but a humble hawk, I rest on your hand alone, might really mean, I will serve you, but betray me, and I fly to your enemy. It was a delicate world, full of double meanings and silent stakes. Fantasy meets flesh. At the heart of courtly love was a paradox. It demanded distance, but thrived on intimacy. It preached chastity, but flirted with sin. It was supposed to elevate, but sometimes destroyed. Many noble women found power in it. They became patrons, poets, players in the game. Others were trapped by it, caught between expectations and desires. Many knights found purpose in it, especially in a world where brutality was common and refinement rare. But some confused the performance for the real thing and paid dearly for it. Still, the songs continued. The glances, the coded gifts, the sighs beneath moonlit towers. Love among the nobles was not like the love we imagine today. It was a mask worn at court, a poem whispered in secret, a flame kept behind glass, always flickering, never consuming. Not every love story in medieval times was whispered from a balcony or sung beneath stained glass. Most of them unfolded in the dirt. The vast majority of people in medieval Europe were peasants, laborers who toiled in fields, fetched water from wells, and lived in small thatched cottages that smelled of smoke, animals, and wet earth. For them, love was not a game of poetry or subtlety. It was lived through glances at the communal oven, shared chores, and stolen conversations behind barns, and most often it led to marriage. But even here, among the lower classes, love was not simple. It had rules, risks, rituals, and it shaped lives in quiet, profound ways. Love and labor. In peasant life, survival came first, so marriages were often practical. Families arranged them based on land, livestock, and the ability to survive winter. But this didn't mean that love was absent. In fact, among peasants, there was often more freedom to choose a partner than among nobles, especially in certain regions and time periods. A young man might notice a girl at the market. She might respond by walking past his stall a little more often. He might offer to help her family bring in the harvest. She might save him a better portion of stew at the feast day meal. It was not grand, it was not poetic, but it was true. Because when you spent your days breaking frozen soil or mending roofs, you came to value small kindnesses, quiet loyalties. That was how love grew, like moss, slow and soft, in the shadow of survival. Courtship rituals in the village. Some communities had courtship customs that lasted for generations. In parts of Germany and Scandinavia, a young man might leave a birch branch or carved token on a girl's doorstep on May Day morning. If she left it there untouched, the interest was not returned. If she moved it indoors, hope flickered. In rural England, church ales, festive drinking events, were unofficial matchmaking grounds. Young people danced, exchanged small gifts, and sometimes arranged to meet again under the moonlight. There were other customs too. Husking bees, corn shucking parties were group activities where flirtation was expected. In some places, a suitor might carve his initials alongside hers into a wooden bench or tree. Sometimes a girl would test a suitor by giving him a task: fetch a specific herb, mend a fence, find a lost animal. If he tried, he was serious. None of these things guaranteed love, but they opened the door to it. Marriage, a binding of lives. Marriage among peasants was a deeply communal event, not just a union of two people, but two families, even two fields. It might involve a small feast with bread, ale, and dancing, a blessing from a local priest, or, in earlier periods, simply a public vow in front of the village, a modest gift exchange, tools, livestock, or clothing. But even before the formal vows, the couple often lived together. In many places, especially before the 13th century, betrothal was nearly as binding as marriage itself. Sex before marriage was common among peasants, provided the intent to marry was real. In fact, some customs expected the bride to be pregnant by the time of the wedding, as proof of fertility. This wasn't scandalous, it was practical. A childless marriage could mean disaster in a world where children were future laborers, caretakers, and security in old age. So in fields and villages, love was often intertwined with life, death, and the hope of a future. Promises and regrets. Not every story had a happy ending. Sometimes a girl fell for a sweet-tongued stranger who left before spring. Sometimes a boy promised marriage but backed out when a better dowry appeared. Sometimes pregnancy came before vows, and the village judged harshly. There were consequences. Church courts in the later Middle Ages became involved in disputes over broken promises, illegitimate children, or hand-fastings that were denied after the fact. Still, most couples found their way. They worked side by side. They shared bread, fire, laughter. They weathered winter, welcomed spring. And sometimes, in the glow of the hearth, surrounded by the scent of stew and smoke and straw, they looked across the room and smiled. Because in a world of hardship and silence, that smile was everything. Love in the long night, when the day's labor was done and the candles burned low and the children were asleep, two people might lie together beneath a heavy woolen blanket, fingers interlaced, the smell of the fields still on their skin. They didn't recite poems. They didn't wear silk. They didn't speak of destiny. But they held each other. And that, more than anything, was love in the medieval world. Not what was said, but what endured. By the late medieval period, love was no longer just a personal matter. It was a spiritual one. The church had grown in power and influence, and with that came rules, a lot of rules, about who could love whom, how, when, and under what sacred terms. But people are not so easily tamed, and so, where there were rules, there were also secrets. This is the story of forbidden love in the medieval world, a story of whispers behind cloister walls, of lovers punished by fire and exile, of desires too strong to obey the law, and of a church trying desperately to draw lines around the heart. The church's view of love. To the medieval church, love was not a private emotion. It was a moral battleground. Marriage was a sacrament, ordained by God, sanctified by the church, and carefully regulated. The goal was not romance. It was legitimacy of children's social order. Moral discipline. Sex, even within marriage, was to be controlled, preferably only for procreation, not pleasure. Love, in its passionate and uncontrollable form, was considered dangerous. It distracted from God. It tempted the soul. It led to sin. This meant that any relationship outside the approved structure of church-sanctioned marriage was forbidden. That included adultery, premarital sex, unless betrothed, same-sex relationships, clerical romances, marrying too close a relative, sometimes even a fourth cousin. But people still loved, and still broke the rules. Secret lovers and scandalous affairs. Some of the most dramatic medieval scandals involved forbidden love. Monks who fell in love with kitchen maids, noblewomen who eloped with knights below their station, clerics who kept lovers in hidden chambers above the sacristy. These were not isolated incidents. Church records from the 13th and 14th centuries are filled with trials, excommunications, and confessions, some tearful, some defiant. In many towns, the church courts acted like early versions of morality police. People could be brought before them for public flirtation, having a child out of wedlock, breaking a promise to marry, living together without vows. Punishments varied: fines, public penance, whippings, forced marriages, or sometimes exile. But for all the laws and sermons, forbidden love endured, because the heart, after all, does not bow easily. Letters, symbols, and lies. Secret relationships found their own language, subtle, hidden, poetic. A woman might send her lover a carved token hidden in a loaf of bread. A man might leave a sprig of rosemary on a doorstep as a silent invitation. Lovers wrote letters in code, using religious language to mask passion. A note might read, "May the Lord watch over you in this holy season." But between the lines, there was more. "I saw you at Vespers. You wore green. I dreamed of your hands." Some forged travel reasons to meet in secret, visiting a cousin, a pilgrimage, delivering goods. Even convents and monasteries, meant to be sanctuaries, became occasional hiding places for romance. The veil didn't always hide the heart, the weight of judgment. For many, the consequences of forbidden love were real and devastating. A pregnant girl abandoned by her lover could face years of hardship and shame. A monk caught in a relationship might be cast out, even executed for heresy. A noblewoman's affair might lead to her family's disgrace, or her own imprisonment in a convent for life. And yet, even amid the risks, there were those who defied the rules. Some lovers fled their villages to marry in secret, called clandestine marriages, often without a priest. These were common enough that the church repeatedly tried to outlaw them. Sometimes, entire villages knew of an affair and kept the secret out of sympathy or fear, or a shared sense of humanity. Because love, even forbidden, was still love, and sometimes people chose it anyway. Martyrs of the Heart history has remembered a few of these stories. Abelard and Heloise, a brilliant philosopher and his gifted student. Their love defied church laws and led to tragedy, castration, and cloistered life, but their letters remain among the most passionate ever written. Eleanor of Brittany, a noblewoman imprisoned for decades in a remote castle. Some say not for treason, but for an affair the crown refused to pardon. Countless nameless lovers buried side by side in country cemeteries, their sins forgotten, their love remembered only in the tilt of stones and the weathering of moss. For all the church's might, for all the sermons and condemnations, one truth echoed through the centuries: the heart makes its own laws. In stories of medieval romance, we often picture youth, lovers meeting in orchards, knights pledging themselves beneath moonlight, maids blushing behind veils. But love did not end at 20 or 30 or even 50. It changed. It softened, deepened, and took on the weight of memory. In a time when lifespans were short and life was hard, love's survival into old age was both rare and precious. This is the quiet chapter, the one we don't often hear, the one where love lingers in wrinkled hands, tired laughter, and farewells whispered by candlelight. Growing old. Together among the peasantry, couples who lasted were often not just romantic partners, but true partners in labor, family, and survival. They raised children, buried them too. They built their homes, seasons at a time. They weathered famine, plague, and war, leaning on each other when the world leaned too hard. And when they spoke of love, it wasn't in poetry, it was in gestures, a blanket mended for winter, bread saved for the other's supper, a quiet presence while one sat by a grave. For noble couples, the end of childbearing years often brought new companionship. Shared reading, religious devotion, and political alliances turned into friendship. Some noble women, once widowed, chose never to remarry, not because they had to, but because no other bond could replace the one they'd lost. Aging couples often became the memory keepers of the village, passing on stories of how they met, how they fell in love, and how, against the odds, they endured. They became proof that love could last, even when teeth fell out, backs bent, and voices faded. Widowhood and remarriage life in the Middle Ages was perilous, and many people lost their partners young. Widowhood was common and complicated. For men, remarriage was often encouraged, especially if children needed raising or land needed tending. For women, it depended. Wealthy widows could wield significant power. Some even ran businesses, held property, and made decisions without male guardianship. Peasant widows often remarried quickly, not for love, but for survival. Yet not all widows remarried. Some chose solitude, some entered convents, and some quietly rekindled old affections with a childhood friend, a long-widowed neighbor, or someone they'd once almost married but hadn't. In this second chapter of life, love returned not as fire, but as embers, and often that was enough. Love after loss. The later years of life brought more than grey hair. It brought loss. The death of a spouse was not just emotional, it could be legally and socially disruptive. Widows had to fight for dower rights. Widowers might be pressured by their families to remarry, and both faced the ache of absence in a world with little time for grief. But they still grieved, quietly, deeply. A husband might visit his wife's grave every Sunday after Mass, leaving a single sprig of lavender. A woman might continue to sleep on only one side of the bed, years after her husband had passed. And in rare cases, both died within days of each other, not because of illness, but because one simply could not live without the other. Chroniclers noted such events with solemn respect. They understood that even in an age of iron and fire, the heart was fragile. Love's legacy. In their final years, aging couples often passed down stories. They told their children how they'd met, how hard it had been to stay together, how worth it all was. They reminded the next generation that love wasn't always roses and ballads. Sometimes it was blisters and broken roofs, but it endured. Monks recorded their deaths in soft ink on yellowing parchment. Church bells tolled, candles were lit, and though most of their names are forgotten today, somewhere in the folds of history, their love still lingers. In the ruins of a cottage buried beneath ivy, in a faded symbol scratched into a pew, in a love song written by someone who once saw two old lovers holding hands. Love, after all, is not just for the young. It is for anyone willing to keep showing up, day after day, winter after winter, even when the poetry fades. A final candle. So let us leave them here. Two old souls seated before a fire. Their fingers are gnarled, their voices soft. They do not need to speak. They have said all they needed to say many years ago. Above them, the stars turn. Outside, the wind whispers. And inside, love remains, gentle, steady, and eternal.